Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Karsh Institute of Democracy. It's great to see you here today. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the academic director here at the Karsh Institute, and along with Jessica and our other wonderful staff, organized this series. We are really excited to have an honored guest here from Yale University, Greg Grandin, a friend, and someone we're really excited to greet here. I think your first trip to UVA, so welcome and thanks for coming. I'm just going to say a few remarks to introduce the proceedings and then hand it over to our interlocutor today. So the way these work is that these are conversations led by usually by UVA faculty about new books. We'll have about 40 minutes of conversation between them. Then there'll be a Q&A, and then afterwards Greg is available to sign books. There's books available for sale in the hallway. And we will be sending out a survey afterwards. So if you have thoughts and comments and suggestions, we always welcome that. I just want to flag that on December 3rd, we have another event here, a really interesting book on artists and the American Revolution, and then a full complement of Touchstones of Democracy events in the spring you can find on our website and already register for. So we hope you'll come back for those. I now want to introduce Anne Garland Mahler, who I'm really delighted is going to be leading this conversation. We really couldn't think of someone better to kind of engage with us around this topic. Mahler is a professor in the Spanish department here and is the author of two wonderful books from Duke University Press, A Wide Net of Solidarity, and that's most recently come out just I guess a few months ago, right? So, and then From the Tricontinental to the Global South was her earlier book. These are both books that look at questions around solidarity and global movements tied to Latin America. So it'll be great for engaging in this conversation. Also the editor of the Oxford History of the Global South, and really a prime thinker around the kind of thinking about the Global South and the Americas more broadly. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Greg Grandin, who is the Peter V. and C. Vann Woodward Professor of History at Yale University, and I would argue the most well-known scholar of Latin American studies in the United States today. He's the author of 7 books, including The Blood of Guatemala, which won the Latin American Studies Association's Bryce Wood Award for the best book published on Latin American in any discipline, The Last Colonial Massacre, Empire's Workshop, which I read in graduate school and was my first introduction to Grandin's work, Fordlandia, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the National Book Critics Award, The Empire of Necessity, which I had the pleasure of hearing Grandin speak on when I was at Emory years ago, and which won the Bancroft and Beveridge Awards in American History, Kissinger's Shadow, and The End of the Myth, which won the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction and was a finalist in the history category. He's co-edited the books A Century of Revolution, which I use in my course on Latin American revolutions, as well as the Guatemala Reader. Grandin has the rare quality of producing work that is both deeply substantive and well-researched and accessible and entertaining. And he's a public scholar who publishes in The Nation and the New York Times, goes on Democracy Now!, et cetera. So we're very honored to have him here today to talk about his new book, América, A New History of the New World, which has already been a finalist for a number of major prizes. So please join me in welcoming Professor Greg Grandin.
Thank you.
So, as you all can see, this is a massive work of scholarship. It covers 5 centuries of intellectual history of inter-American relations and inter-American international law and political thought. And there are so many insights in this book. I learned a great deal from reading it, and I wanted to hear first about your inspiration for writing it. So, why do we need a new history of the New World, and why do we need it now?
Well, that was a quick question. I thought we were going to have a little bit more of a run-up.
Nope.
The book is a kind of summation of many things that I've been thinking about Latin America and the importance of Latin America, and trying to think about Latin America as something other than a place where the United States intervenes. A place of a kind of, actor in a more morality story of U.S. arrogance and U.S. power, which is how often in popular terms Latin America is understood, and certainly is a place where the United States intervenes, but I think there's a deeper history, and it brings together a number of concerns. One is the persistence of a conception of democracy in Latin America, despite the amount of violence and despite the oftentimes crisis politics that overtakes any given country at any given moment, of social democracy, conception of democracy that is not just about proceduralism, not just about elections, but is about some form of wealth redistribution, some form of human dignity and solidarity, and why that lasts. And I'm not saying it's universal and it happens all the time in every country, but the social movements in Latin America are deeply humanist and deeply universal, and the forms of nationalism in Latin America, although I must say that the spread of a kind of a cultural politics associated with Trumpism is eating away at this, but there's a nationalism that hasn't really devolved into a kind of toxic nationalism that we see in the Philippines, in the United States, in Israel, in Russia, in Hungary, Turkey. There's a nationalism that still sees itself as a stepping stone to universalism. And I think that trying to explain the persistence of that is one of the reasons for the book, and obviously the importance of it is fairly obvious in the times that we live in. I started the book in the last years of the Trump administration, and I finished it in the first year of the second Trump administration through COVID and through the genocide in Gaza. So the book starts with the conquest, and I ended it as events in Israel and Gaza and Palestine unfolded. So that's the reason for the book, to try to think of a new way to try to bring to the fore a conception of democracy the way that even in the U.S. democracy used to be conceived as social democracy, as entailing something more than just technocratic proceduralism. And I know that's a long answer to a short question, but I'll just say one more thing. There's a lot of talk about U.S. exceptionalism, and obviously American exceptionalism means many things to different people. It could mean a lack of class conflict, or political conflict is contained within a two-party system. It could mean the prosperity and wealth of the United States, that the United States has some providential mission. I think of U.S. exceptionalism as more specific, it's almost a cultish obsession with the idea of individual rights, of political rights, and so a major tension of the book is a kind of individual rights political culture as defining citizenship in the United States in tension with the social rights culture in Latin America. And to explain that tension and its importance historically, I go back to the conquest, and I come forward to the present, and the book, one last thing I'll say is the book is an argument for the centrality of Spanish and then Latin America's role in the creation of the liberal multilateral order, that many of the ideas that were present in San Francisco in 1945 with the founding of the United Nations, you could have found in Spanish America in the 1830s after Spanish American independence. But we'll go into those details later.
And was there something about this moment that made you want to write this particular book?
Well, as I said, the general crisis of democracy, the general crisis of humanism, the general crisis of universalism, and a sense that Latin America is a place that still holds true, that still takes the radical Enlightenment at its word, and to some degree, not everywhere and not in every place and not at all times, but that there is this sense that there is something exceptional about Latin America, without romanticizing Latin America.
So you start the book focused on the ethical dilemmas that arose surrounding conquest and slavery, particularly through the interventions of Bartolomé de las Casas. And you discussed the intellectual and moral critique of the conquest that emerged in the Spanish colonies in a way that was different from the British colonies. And then from there, you lead into the central role that abolitionism played in the independence movements of the Spanish colonies. So why did you decide? I mean, I understand why you started with the conquest, but why did you decide to start the book with Bartolomé de las Casas and the ethical debates in which he was engaged?
Yeah, I started with De las Casas. For those who I'm sure many in the room know who he was, and maybe some don't. He was a very prominent figure, and he's held up as kind of a humanitarian, somebody who advocated for the rights and dignity of Native Americans. And I think that he in many ways was more important than that. And not just on his own, but as part of a larger cohort of Dominicans, of theologians, of Franciscans, of jurists, of philosophers within Catholicism that challenged the legitimacy and questioned the legality of the Spanish conquest. Now, the book doesn't hold any water at all, obviously, for the Spanish conquest. It was what one demographer called the greatest human mortality event in history, somewhere between around 100 million people lived in the Americas when the Spanish arrived, and within a century, 90% of them were gone. The population dropped. In the first wave, of course, was violence and dispossession and enslavement and demands for extraction of minerals, and then eventually agriculture, and then of course the introduction of African slavery. Spanish conquest was horrific beyond imagination, but there did emerge, in some ways, the Spanish Empire was the first empire that had the terms of its own negation written into its actions, and largely that took place within Catholic theology, within Catholic universalism. There was a cohort of Catholics who denied the legality, who insisted that Native Americans were human and equal to Europeans. And the argument of the book is that you could trace political modernism and a social democratic modernism to the conquest. And the argument is, out of the barbarism comes a commitment to humanism. Early on, people like De las Casas, Francisco Vitoria, other theorists, Anton Montesinos, other Dominicans and other Franciscans, put forward a notion of human equality of all people, and the contrast with the British. It's of course the British colonial project starts a century later. What's unique, what's distinguishable about the Spanish conquest is that they didn't deny that people existed, right? That was the whole center of the debate. And the Spanish Empire was founded on this tension between a religion that understood itself as universal, but an empire that set itself up to the administration of difference. And individuals, Native Americans and African Americans, were the main thing of the empire. Of course, they were the main thing because they extracted the wealth, they extracted the gold and the silver, which became the first universal standard in terms of money, in terms of currency, which then flowed into Europe and remade Europe. But they were also the main thing in terms of morality. Of course, the majority of Spanish Catholics did not criticize the conquest, but justified it. But they still dealt with the reality of Native Americans. There was no denying the reality. The British, on the other hand, is this great kind of set piece that I use in the book, where the Virginia Company, around 1609, they call a meeting and they decide to have a debate. They decide to have a discussion of whether they're going to issue a proclamation to justify the colonies in the Chesapeake Bay, and then eventually New England. And it's clear that they've paid attention to what was going on in Spain, and it's clear that they felt that the arguments in Spain put up a significant moral obstacle to what they intended to do in the New World. They basically said, look, the Spanish have been arguing about this for a century and they can't find a solid justification for dominion, much less enslavement. So it's better that we don't say anything at all and just do it. and it's that evasion, right, that denial and evasion that was there right at the beginning of the British colonial project. That it doesn't happen just in the realm of ideas. I know I'm talking about the realm of ideas, but the social project of British colonialism, without denying the importance of Native Americans in the first wave of slavery and then in the fur trade, Native Americans really were just bit players in the moral imagination of Anglo-colonialism. They might as well have been packs of wolves, indexes of God's pleasure or displeasure, right? And the stories they told about themselves, about their moral progress. Unlike Spanish colonialism, in which there was such a profound degree of social solidarity or interconnectedness and awareness of the reality of people, of individuals. And so if we go back to, as I talked earlier, that one of the points of the book is to contrast the emergence and persistence of a kind of a cultish adherence to individual rights in the United States and almost an endurance of social rights in Latin America. I go back to the conquest to look at both the ideational origins of those two different traditions, but then how they manifest and how they play out within the different colonial projects. Now, I do want to say, I have the voice of my editor, Sarah Erstel, in my head, who's at all of these events, she says, tell stories, stop with the big arguments. She said, nobody follows the big arguments, they want to hear stories. And she said, you're too abstract when you do these things. And I don't know how to convey what I've tried to do in the book by telling the stories when I'm up here. But I do want to say the book is filled with a lot of stories, and it's a narrative history. But what I'm talking about here is the larger kind of intellectual arc of the book. Even if maybe AG could affirm.
I can attest.
That
it's filled with many fascinating anecdotes.
The book is not just me going on about social rights throughout 700 pages.
It is filled with many fascinating anecdotes. It's very, very readable. But yeah, a lot of my questions are more geared towards the kind of larger arguments. So one of the key takeaways from the book is that the U.S. was founded on a notion of expansion, versus Latin American nations that were founded in interstate cooperation and uti possidetis, where borders of the new nations were made to reflect existing colonial administrative borders, right? And so you argue that two versions of Americanism came out of the era of independence. So you've talked a little bit about that already, but I don't know if you want to say anything more about these two different versions of Americanism and perhaps how they're relevant today.
Yeah, and this is an extension of what I was just talking about. So I mean, in the United States breaks away from Great Britain, and its founders imagined themselves to be alone on a continent, or empty enough continent. Now, obviously, it wasn't, right? There was Native American sovereignties, there was the Spanish Empire, there would be Mexico, but there was little doubt that the United States would expand. In many ways, the American Revolution was fought to get into the Ohio Valley, where Benjamin Franklin and George Washington had staked significant amounts of land that they hoped to speculate and make money on. And that expansion would carry forward. George Washington wasn't the first, but in his farewell address, he both called the United States America and called all of North America America. And that gap was aspirational. The idea was that eventually the United States would be America. And there was a resurrection of the doctrine of conquest. I mean, whether it be Indian removal and Indian removals, whether it be the war on Mexico, the doctrine of conquest was invoked. The doctrine of conquest was taught in U.S. law schools up until the 1920s as a legitimate doctrine within international law. Latin America, in contrast, comes into the world in the 1820s, without going into all of the details, through multiple independence movements in southern South America, northern South America, and Mexico. They come into the world already a league of nations, already a community of nations. 7 independent republics, and Brazil, which has this weird status as an independent monarchy, but 8 polities, 7 of them republics, that have to learn how to live with each other, right? They can't resurrect the doctrine of conquest in order to justify sovereignty. Each nation both threatens and legitimates the other, legitimates each other because each one legitimates the possibility and of breaking from Spanish imperial rule and creating a republic, but threatens because under the old terms of law and war, what would to stop Argentina from adopting the doctrine of conquest like the United States and say, we want the Pacific too, and rolling over. And there emerges among people like Bolivar, I focus mostly on Bolivar and his relationship with his foreign minister, Pedro Gal, but others as well, the idea that there needed to be a new conception of international relations, a new conception of sovereignty. They also didn't like Europe's post-Napoleonic settlement, the idea of a kind of conservative balance of power in which each nation, of course Europe wasn't nations, they were proto-empires, pushing against each other, pursuing their own interests, and with the premise that competition is the natural order of the international war. Bolivar explicitly understood that as fundamentally unstable, that if you didn't have a transcendental value, a higher good, that would inevitably lead for war. So the 2 theories of sovereignty, the United States' resurrection of a very brutal doctrine of sovereignty, doctrine of conquest, or Europe's balance of power, wouldn't work in Spanish America. And so they came up with, a fairly, with what becomes, and this is what I said earlier, a set of principles that eventually evolve into what's put into place in San Francisco in 1945. One is a respect for borders. They come up with this idea that we might not like Spanish colonialism, but Spanish colonialism gave us a set of viceregal borders that we have to accept. Now, in practice, it was more complicated, but the idea that borders were borders, they didn't correspond to rivers, they rejected the idea of natural borders. They basically took the borders as imposed by the Spanish Empire as the borders of the new nations. Now, that's not to say there weren't fights and skirmishes and out-and-out wars, but each war and each skirmish turned to the doctrine of ute possidetis, as you possess, an old Roman law doctrine that had been a doctrine of conquest, meaning you got to keep what you grabbed. They turned that into a doctrine of peace, meaning, we have to respect each other's borders. More importantly, they came up with the idea that the principle of international law should be cooperation, that there was shared interest between all the sister nations. And again, this becomes one of the foundational premises of liberal internationalism, that cooperation and multilateralism and should be the foundation of international law, not inherent competition. And again, none of this precludes. None of this is to say that this worked pristinely in Latin America and Spanish America at the time, but the premises were there, and the conflicts that emerged was settled by invoking those premises. So, and the other thing that's also important is that early doctrine of conquest, critique of conquest, of Spanish conquest, right? That de las Casas, that Vitoria applied against Spain, the new founders of Spanish America, living underneath an expanding nation that would become the greatest power in world history in terms of wealth and in terms of repressive power, moving across the continent like a whirligig, they basically transposed that critique that was applied to Spain and applied it to the United States. So there was already a very, they had on hand, they also had a very different relationship to the idea of conquest. Spanish American declarations of independence and constitutions tended to critique the conquest and see independence as atonement for the conquest. And again, the practice of atonement wasn't ideal. There was a lot of hypocrisy between words and deeds. But there was this idea that the conquest was something that had to be amended, that had to be atoned for. Now, of course, in the United States, no founding person, father, thought that the settlement of Massachusetts or Chesapeake Bay needed to be atoned for, right? Woodrow Wilson famously said that the American Revolution wasn't even a revolution. All it did was methodize a series of ideas about liberty that were present at the conception of settlement. Now, John Adams said it wasn't, the United States didn't conquer North America, it just settled in North America. So there was, that relationship. In other words, already there was that self-critique and that was present at the conquest carried forward through independence, and then was applied to the United States. And a lot of the history of the 19th century and the emergence of Latin American jurists and diplomats. A lot of the book focuses on the persistent efforts to get the United States to give up the doctrine of conquest, which of course the United States refuses to do until 1933, which we can talk about later. But that's another tension in the book. Latin America trying to get the United States to give up the doctrine of conquest. The United States says there can't be such a thing as American international law. There can only be international law. And doctrine of conquest is a valid doctrine within international law.
So you've spoken to this a little bit already, but you trace how at certain times in history, the U.S. was really influenced by the kind of Latin American version of Americanism that you're talking about, particularly in Wilsonian internationalism and his thinking on the League of Nations, and FDR's good neighbor, Pan-Americanism, and the creation of the United Nations. So I didn't know if you wanted to tell us a little bit more about Latin American influence on U.S. political thought.
Yeah, so throughout the 19th century, there emerges, as I say, a theory of international law associated with a number of different prominent jurists that is opposed to war, that is, thinks all war is a crime, that is opposed to the military using gunships to collect debt and whatnot. The United States and is constantly trying to get the United States to reject the right of intervention within Latin America. A lot of this revolves around the interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. To backtrack a little bit, within the Monroe Doctrine, it's a kind of contradictory doctrine that's both anti-colonial, Europe keep out, and the United States is going to respond to a threat anywhere as if it's in the hemisphere, as if it's a threat to itself. So it's both a universal warrant for intervention and a kind of and so Latin Americans keep trying to put forward their version of the Monroe Doctrine, which is the anti-colonial. They like the anti-colonial bit, but they don't like and they keep on thinking. And there's one Chilean, Alejandro Alvarez. He's a little bit later in the 20th century. He understands the history. He has a whole Hegelian theory that what you need is the United States as a unilateral power to enforce its will, but at some point that hard core of realpolitik will give way to idealism, and the full flowering of international law will emerge from American power. He was a bit of an optimist. But Wilson himself, so when Wilson comes to power, he's confronted with the Mexican Revolution, and the book spends a lot of time talking about his engagement with the Mexican Revolution. I wouldn't say the book rehabilitates Woodrow Wilson, but it does kind of situate his turn toward the darkness in relationship to the Mexican Revolution and his turn towards war and his eventually giving up his more utopian vision of what the League of Nations is for a kind of mandatory power and a affirmation of European colonialism. I trace that out in relationship to Latin America. I mean, his relationship to the Mexican Revolution is quite complex. He comes to office thinking that revolutions, basically all end in tyranny. He thinks every revolution winds up as Haiti or France. But then he sees the Mexican Revolution and he actually thinks it's justified. And he's quite sympathetic, believe it or not, to Pancho Villa and to Carranza and to I don't think he likes Zapata that much. But his wrestling with Latin America and a lot of the early conceptions of what a world order would look like after the European conflict is based on Pan-Americanism. It's explicitly based on Pan-Americanism. He says it flat out, and so there's a lot of influence that way. And then the real meat of this argument of the book is the good neighbor policy from 1933 to 1943, and Cordell Hull, a Jacksonian from Tennessee, whose father fought in the Civil War, was one-eyed vengeance dealer. He tracked some Union soldier down for a decade and shot him in the back because he blinded him. Cordell Hull, Cordell's an unlikely father of the international system, considering he came from the Cumberland, Tennessee, and considering who his father was. But Cordell Hull goes down to Montevideo to a Pan American conference, and every one of these Pan American conferences were more or less the same up until this one in 1933, where the U.S. basically listens to Latin America complaining about intervention in Nicaragua and Haiti and Dominican Republic or whatever, gunboat intervention, and basically ignoring all of Latin American demands. FDR sends Cordell Hull down to this one and said, "Listen, you do it. Give them lights so they can land planes at night and promise them money to build roads. But whatever you do, don't listen to them when it comes to intervention." FDR tells Hull, but Hull's a free trader, and in his mind, he sees a correlation between giving up the right to intervention and reestablishing some kind of free trade regime. And he also has the good luck of having Ernest Gruning, who's an editor of The Nation, a radical reporter, wrote on Mexico, wrote on Haiti, became a big advocate, anti-imperialist, compared the United States occupation to Haiti to the Belgians' colony in the Congo. And Gruning basically had his ear all the way down to Montevideo and convinced Hull that actually giving in to Latin American demands would help stabilize the world order. And unexpectedly, Hull basically capitulates completely to everything Latin America had been asking for decades. Especially, he recognizes the absolute sovereignty of any nation, large or small, and he gives up the right to intervene the right to U.S. intervention in Latin American affairs. And it's probably the most successful diplomatic initiative in U.S. history because it turns everything around. Hull is treated as an unconquering hero. There's headlines in the New York Times, the age of imperialism is over. Hull goes back thinking he's going to get called to the carpet by FDR, but by the time he's back, FDR has already adopted the idea as his own and claimed it and said, yeah, I sent him down. I told him that this was my idea. It was FDR. He was quite an astute politician. And this set the stage for the good neighbor policy. And the good neighbor policy was more than just a phrase, and it was more than just all of these things that I just talked about, giving up intervention. The good neighbor policy became Roosevelt's domestic get out the vote vehicle. That's what they call it. Good neighbor leagues were set up everywhere to run for re-election in 1936. And there was this remarkable kind of way of creating this new norm, a new moral vision of how the world should be organized. So there was an analogy between tolerance of international pluralism, of all the different kinds of nations that were in Latin America, and domestic pluralism. So the Good Neighbor Leagues brought together, Latinos in the Southwest and African Americans in Chicago and white ethnics in New York. And it was a way for Cordell Hull to talk about his free trade treaties, which brought a lot of business people back into the FDR coalition who broke with him after some of the more radical initiatives. And these good neighbor leagues were really quite remarkable. And FDR wins that election he wins with 26 million votes. He wins more votes than any other human being ever received prior to him, and he won it largely on a social democratic platform. And the first thing he does within a week is he sails to Rio de Janeiro, and then he sails to Buenos Aires. And he begins to organize Latin America for the coming conflict again in Europe. And again, none of this is straightforward, but for the most part, FDR not only tolerates economic nationalists, but he funds a steel mill in Brazil. He funds an oil industry, refinery in Mexico. He's tolerating economic nationalists. He's tipping the field in favor of the social democratic left or the economic nationalist left. And why this is important is because grand strategists looked at Latin America and they saw Spain. They saw a lot of the social variables that led to the rise of fascism in Spain. Small landed elites controlling enormous political power, a rising militant peasant class, a rising militant labor movement, but conservative Catholic patricians thinking that the family structure and Catholicism was under threat, and they thought they certainly thought Mexico could turn into a Spanish Civil War, and they thought all of Spain, all of Latin America could fall to kind of Franco-like authoritarians, and if that happened, it would be a geostrategic disaster because it would just create an alliance between Germany, Italy, Spain, and then a divided Latin America. But that didn't happen. Latin America lined up, Argentina is complicated. We can talk about Argentina, but for the most part, Latin America lined up fully behind the United States, which was an enormous, obviously the Soviet Union won World War II, but Latin America was key. The United States didn't have to fight one war for resources. It didn't have to worry about its southern flank. It had, all of the minerals, all of the oil that it used, everything, all of the procurement of natural resources just flew into the United States from Latin America. Brazil, that part that juts out into the Atlantic, became the trampoline of the Atlantic into Northern Africa, sending troops and material up. It was an enormous success. And there was this sense between 1933 and 1943 when there was a social democratic consensus. Not every country was social democratic, but there was a sense that they weren't just fighting fascism, they were fighting for social democracy. I date 1943 as the turning point because that's when Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president, does a tour of Latin America. And Henry Wallace, more than anybody else, is kind of the vanguard of this kind of thinking about the post-war as social democracy. He builds into his procurement treaties, procurement contracts with Latin America, whether it's for rubber or oil or tin in Bolivia, what he calls labor clauses, which forbids racial discrimination, demands decent housing. Basically, it's a whole social democratic program built into a labor contract. And all of the more conservative wing of the New Deal that are also that FDR, for whatever reason, had also given to Latin America and through these different agencies. They hate this. They despise this. They despise these labor clauses. And a lot of them are Southerners, William Clayton from Mississippi, Burns, from Texas. Henry Wallace called them all the Texans, meaning the slavers. And then Wallace does a tour of Latin America, and he's treated as if he's the president-elect. They think that FDR is not going to run for a fourth term. They think Wallace is going to be the next president. And the outpouring adoration, and Wallace, speaking in front of labor movements, communist allied labor movements, saying you're the vanguard of democracy, and after we beat the fascists on the battlefield, the real war against fascism begins. In the book, I kind of make the argument that this is where they make the decision that Wallace has to go. This is it. There's a lot of different theories about when they turn against Wallace, but his actions in Latin America are pretty. And it's right after this that the first kind of it's not quite the second Red Scare yet, but they go after Wallace's Bureau of Economic Warfare. They start purging them. It's after and then this is also when the war starts to turn. This is also when the Soviets break the siege and the Soviet army starts making advances. And when that happens, there's a shift in tone. And all of those New Dealers that loved Latin America, Rex Tugwell, Henry Wallace, and others are isolated, and a new kind of men who made their names in the war, when it's about scale and logistics and technology, and not about redistribution, not about holding up Latin America as a model of cooperation. They still do rhetorically, but Latin America kind of gets shunted aside. So between 33 and 43 is really the golden years of that influence, and then comes then the Cold War, then the U.S. wins the war, then the Cold War comes.
So yeah, and I do have a question here about that move from Latin America, the U.S. really relying on Latin America to defeat fascism, and then the turn towards intense anti-communism, and also the narrative that you tell about the assassination of Jorge Gaitan, and in that. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over that turn to Cold War anti-communism, and just say that. So one of the things that you leave us with is that Latin America has shown the way historically for how to resist fascism. And this seems pretty important considering what we're facing right now in this country. So I just wanted to ask, if you could say more about the lessons that we can learn in the fight against fascism.
Yeah. That's a big question, because it's not always successful. You write these big sweeping books and you want to draw out the main points, but there's lots of exceptions where the fight against fascism was lost in Latin America, obviously, for long periods of time. But I do think that the insistence that democracy has to be something more than procedural and technocratic, that it has to offer a dignified life. I mean, FDR himself said it. He said that, I quoted in the book that that unless the alternative is some form of wealth redistribution and some form of social democracy, then we really have nothing to offer in the fight against the extremists. And I think that Latin America, to a large degree, to be anti-fascist meant to be some kind of social democrat. But it's more than that. I think it's also I think there's a politics in Latin America. I think to be just to be as crude as possible, there's a division between Homo economicus and Homo, whatever the Latin would be for political. In the United States, the separation within the Democratic Party, I think, to believe that they're non-ideological and that it's all just technocratic reform is all you need, rather than understand that you need ideology to fight ideology. This belief in the United States that the other side has ideology, that the bad guys have ideology, and we have means-tested tax brackets or whatever for child care if you make under $3,000 a year or something. I don't know, whatever it is. But the sense that to be human is to be political and to be ideological and to embody that politics. And I think that there's a way in which, to a large degree, social movements in Latin America, no matter what's happening on the governing level, still, politics is where individuation happens. Right? There is this conceit within modernization theory that individuation happens in the economic realm through the marketplace. Whereas I think the history of Latin America shows that individuation and a sense of oneself happens through politics, happens through fighting for a better world. And I think that the United States kind of has to get back to that. And I think that it does, whatever, it's too early. It's too early to tell, just like showing Lau said about the French Revolution. But Mamdani, I think, in New York, aside from the politics, aside from his positions on the Middle East, I think he represents a sense of politics as a way of life and as a way of being in the world, and that's attractive to people. And I think that is a very Latin American kind of politics. I think that, and so even in places, when Brazil was run by Bolsonaro, the landless movement, the largest social movement in the world, grew in membership and amount of territory it controlled. I think that there is this ongoing persistence. Now, that said, I do think that the culture wars have been exported down into Latin America. I think that first wave of post-Cold War Latin American left governments were dealing with very traditional conservatives who didn't know how to respond, and hence Lula and Chavez and Kirchner and Bachelet, they dominated the rhetorical realm. And now I think there's been a fast learning curve among conservatives in Latin America that has embraced a lot of the cultural politics of the United States, and they've filled that void, the recession of the left, with a kind of world-making conspiracism, and that's been very effective in some countries. But whatever's happening there's still these social movements, right? I mean, more environmentalist activists are executed in Latin America than any other region in the world, and yet the environmental movement in one country after another still fights. Right? Same is true for labor movements. Same is true for peasant movements. There is this persistence and a deep commitment to humanism, and these struggles don't evolve into kind of ethnic particularity and a kind of revanchist anger, right? They still kind of embody the best principles of social democratic humanism, even as they incorporate different identities and different concerns that aren't directly related to traditional political, economic. I think Latin America has also been very flexible in its ability to incorporate fights around sexuality, fights around gender, fights around race. Not everywhere, not all the time. There's plenty to critique. But compared to the United States, where we have to be told that we actually are intersectional, right? Rather than Latin America kind of lives it. So I think that's something we can learn.
Well, I have a million more questions, and I wish I could force you to sit here and answer my questions for another hour, but we need to open it up to the audience in a Q&A. Do you want me to facilitate this?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. We've got a hand in the... Oh, yeah. Charlotte, Professor Rogers.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, I'm Charlotte Rogers in the Spanish department. I'm a colleague of Professor Mahler's. I've really loved the way that you structured this book. I thought your leaning into storytelling was a notable strategy. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit about how you decided to structure the book around the salient figures of hemispheric importance. What are the pros and cons of that strategy? How did you strike a balance between the anecdote and the abstract? How did you decide which figures to foreground and who to leave in the background? I'm asking for a friend. Thanks.
AG answers this question. There's less forethought, than just and just trying to write and like. There's a relationship between. I started during COVID, and the book is mostly secondary source. I mean, it's not it's not a primary resource book. I mean, a little bit, but not really. And I started during COVID when HathiTrust was wide open, and you can read all of this, and then, which was a problem when I went back to the footnotes. Was like, it's everything that it got all closed down again. But I just did a deep reading in De las Casas, and it was reading through and trying to pull out, like, I didn't know any of that stuff about his confessional strategy. It was all new to me. Like, that was, and once I read that he had come up with the strategy of using the confessional as a form of reversing the conquest, I was like, that obviously has to be part of the book, right? So then that becomes part of the book, So it's just a going back and forth between your reading, but then as you're moving forward and you're thinking of what gaps. There's a lot. Obviously, the vast majority of history is left out because history is, And so I'm less concerned with what I'm leaving out because you're always leaving out things than if there's a kind of if there's a connective tissue that runs through it. So there's one. So I wanted to have a chapter. I wanted to deal with the post-independence recession and sense of disappointment in Latin America that independence had failed, and yet there was this return of a kind of radical politics linked to 1848. I could have told that story through any number of country. I could have done it in Mexico. I could have done it through Mexico and the war on the U.S. war in Mexico. But Francisco Bilbao was such an outstanding personality and was such a useful connection. And in many ways, he's Bolivar purified of all of the racist dross and everything. So it seemed to make sense to have that chapter on Chile, right? Not because but it could have been a chapter on Mexico, and that's a chapter in Young America, and making the argument that the Young America movement was not just in the United States, but was a hemispheric wide movement, even if they didn't necessarily call themselves Young America. And so it's just more of a trial and error and pushing through and getting to the end. And then using Gaitan, I did always think that I was going to use Gaitan's execution as a way of dealing with the Cold War, because that's such a compressed moment of explosion that goes out in so many different directions that, that was something that I had thought with forethought that was going to use as the climax of the book.
Okay, we have a bunch of hands, so why don't we take 3 questions, and then you can kind of pick and choose what you want to. Yeah. Yes.
Hey. So I was wondering if you thinking about the possibly impending U.S. war against Venezuela, if you think that these tendencies historically in South America toward Bolivarian Pan-Americanism, Usi Pasades's Juris, things like that, might influence the way that the South American right would look at such a war? Is that something that could put the brakes on support, even though there's a lot of support for MAGA in the Southern Cone, that might influence them to stand against the Trump administration on this? And do you think that could have any influence on the way things unfold? So,
I mean, like if you compare it to Reaganism and Reagan comes to power in 81 and he immediately begins to organize Latin America under the rubric of anti-communism and some of its more extreme hysterical versions in Central America, where he gives to the rights different constituencies, and that works because there is a social base for anti-communism, conservative anti-communism, particularly at that moment in Latin America, and it largely worked, and set the stage for Clintonian globalization. Trumpism is a little different. I think it's a little bit more chaotic. I think there is obviously a social base for Trumpism in Latin America. That's fairly obvious. But it is true that Trumpism also kind of, every action it takes seems to negate its own success. That said, some of the polls are really worrying. Like, there seems to be some support for intervention. Like, every country, including Pinochet's Chile, opposed U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989, right? The United States had to lecture the OAS in a very telling speech. Luigi, whatever his name is, in I can never say his last name, that diplomat in ENUADI, I can't pronounce it, but he lectured Latin Americans on democracy, and everybody was opposed, and they were in favor, they were defending sovereignty. Now it seems I don't know if that polling company Atlas Intel that's based in Brazil, which has a remarkably successful record of polling, has these really chilling figures of how much support there would be for an intervention in Venezuela. So nothing, history changes, things change, ideas die, and values are corrupted. I don't know, but I don't think that Trump can organize that. I think the bigger thing is, right? America First doesn't see the United States as superintending a global order organized around open markets. They see the global order as fragmented sovereignties in which regional hegemons organize their spheres of influence. So naturally, the United States has to organize Latin America. But how does Trump do that? Right? I mean, does he do it by unleashing the Marco Rubio faction that wants Venezuela to be the first step to bringing down Cuba, then Nicaragua, then isolating Brazil, and or does it do it through believe it or not, there are moderates within the Trump administration. I don't know if you call them moderates, but people like Richard Grenell who want to make deals with Maduro. They want the oil. They don't think they necessarily need a war. Grenell's vision. Grenell just got exemptions for Chevron to pump oil in Venezuela a week before Marco Rubio started shooting boats out of the Caribbean. I mean, that speedboat strategy was clearly an attempt, of factions within the Trump administration, of the Rubio, the war party's faction trying to end the Grenell faction that wanted to, and it worked to a degree, but now it seems like Trump is backing away from the war. It's hard to tell, and the elections obviously will have some effect that we had last week. I don't know, but certainly to the question of that does. I mean, Javier Milei said that he'd support an intervention in Venezuela. That would have been unheard of. That wouldn't have been possible in '89 against Panama.
Let's take two questions. So this question, and then there's another one back there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to out myself as someone who has not read the book but is enthusiastic about doing so. And I couldn't help but remember another hemispheric history from about 15 years ago, Felipe Fernandez Armesto's book on the Americas. And it seemed to me that the point of departure of that book was that the idea was that the basic problem of hemispheric history is explaining how it is that the United States emerged as a rich and powerful country and the former Spanish and Portuguese colonies emerged as less rich and less powerful countries. And what I found refreshing in everything that you've said is that I have heard nothing of that old assumption that we need to expect we need to explain Latin America's failure in some way. On the contrary, I'm hearing you talk about Latin America as this wonderfully generative place about political ideas, ways of being. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've seen the whole discourse of Latin American failure over the course of your career, where it come from, and what we should be doing about it.
Greg, do you mind holding while we get one more question? Okay, right here in front.
It was very interesting to hear you talk about the difference between nationalism being seen as a stepping stone to universalism in Latin America versus, implicitly, you were saying in the United States, nationalism is seen as a venue for conquest. I was interested in if you could talk about how Latin America generally conceives of freedom. Because you've talked about in the past, I think, where in the United States, the dominant perspective on freedom is freedom from restriction. How is freedom seen in Latin America?
Yeah.
So the discourse of failure and then the Latin American rhetoric on freedom, or notion of
Yeah,
freedom.
I mean, I've used this little tagline before, and I'll just say it again. Hopefully, nobody's heard me say it. For decades, at least since the transition to democracy literature at the end of the Cold War, the primary question asked of Latin America is why is Latin America democracy so weak, at least in terms of its institutions. But obviously that question should be turned on its head, and the question should be why is democracy, at least as an ideal, so persistent despite the death squads and the tortures and the disappearances that it doesn't devolve into kind of a toxic nationalism, ethnic particularity, religious fundamentalism. Again, that said, with the caveat that there does seem to be something going on now that's a little scary, related to the culture, the importation of the culture wars. Who's the person that you referenced?
Felipe Fernandez.
Yeah, Felipe Fernandez. You want to read a really scathing pan of my book, is you could read his book. He hated the book. And then we had this. He's a strange guy and the book and the review is kind of incoherent because he just rehearses a lot of the arguments about the environment and culture, and I don't know. He's a weird monarchist, but he has a British accent. I don't know what his story is. But yeah, in the TLS, and then we had this back and forth, and it was such an unbendingly critical review. He hated this book with a passion. But yeah, it's a different perspective, And he seemed to get mad because but then it was a weird defense of the conquest. I was emailing. I was like, if you just would calm down a little bit, you would see the book practically defends Spanish Catholicism if you would just calm down. But he didn't like the treatment of the conquest. He thought I was taking Bartolomé de las Casas at his word and his descriptions of the atrocities, which I guess I did. But in terms of what was the question again? Just quickly.
The Latin American concept of freedom.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, right? Because Fernando Miranda. Oh God, what's his first name?
Francisco.
Francisco. I have like 2 chapters on my career. Francisco Miranda, Venezuelan. When he's traveling around the United States, in the 1780s, he comes upon Samuel Adams, son of liberty, Samuel Adams, and he says, I have a question. This is before the Constitution, so it must have been the Articles of Declaration. He said, how does a country that claims to be founded on Republican virtue, but all of its laws only defend property, and it has no conception of virtue aside from freedom, protection of property? This is a question that Miranda asked Adams, and Adams acts, at least according to Miranda in his diary, acts as if he doesn't really understand the question. And the point is that if because the United States has a conception of virtue is rooted in freedom, right? That you restrain the state, and you have a constitution that is wholly negative, mosaic in its prescriptions, right? Thou shalt not. And you expand one's area of liberty, and virtue sprouts from that. And, Latin American founders admired that. They appreciated the United States' dynamism, but they didn't think the social basis for that vision of freedom existed after 3 centuries of Spanish empire, in which a small landed class presided over racially stratified, and so they also adhere to a more traditional Republican vision in which the individual didn't exist outside of society. And a lot of the constitutions and declarations of independence explicitly said that there is no individual without society. You have to have both. And again, this is the idea of social rights. And a lot of that goes back to the critique of the conquest, because people like De Las Casas, in responding to defenders of the conquest who said that the Native Americans were subhuman or animals and could be enslaved, De Las Casas said, no, the conquistadores are animals because they've stripped themselves of all human restraint, of all social restraint. The Native Americans are gente, they're individuals who live in society. And that concept kind of made it into, it certainly made it into Venezuela's first Declaration of Independence in 1810, 1811, and went on. Obviously this balance between social and economic rights, between freedom freedom and what's the society or whatever, economic democracy and individual democracy. It's there in the Declaration of Human Rights that the Chilean Hernán Santa Cruz was very instrumental in drafting. He said you had to have both. That's and for the most part, and we were talking about this earlier, even like Cubans who hated Castro, they come to the United States and they get involved in union movements. They still have a sense of they don't, despite the best efforts of the Chicago boys, they didn't, most Latin Americans didn't think that national health care would lead to serfdom, But that said, there are now obviously ideologues like Marco Rubio understands what he means when he says that, healthcare is slavery. You know what I mean? Like there is a self-conscious attempt to import a U.S. vision of economic freedom and individualism into a new political common sense that is certainly there, if not dominant in Latin America.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Yes, sir.
So, I grew up in South America. You can believe it.
Where?
I don't ever, and I went to grade school, never heard of De Las Casas. Simón Bolívar was the liberator who sent his nephew to this very university to learn about democracy. So I'm perplexed. And secondly, would you give us a current assessment of democracy in Latino America, focusing on Venezuela, for instance, and Brazil? How do you view it? The state of democracy. Again, this being the Karsh Institute of Democracy.
Yeah.
And I just have to make an observation, having grown up in South America.
Which country?
Colombia.
Oh, yeah.
I was continually perplexed, and still am, at how Americans don't understand, especially Sudamerica. And I'm honestly perplexed at your take, because it goes against everything I knew growing up and being amongst the people, la gente, there. So, what gives? Enlighten me.
Well, yes, there's Venezuela, and we could understand. You understand the collapse of that society through a number of different ways, including oligarchic intransigence that wouldn't allow any reform. You could look at the economic sanctions that the United States has placed on it, and you can also look at tactical decisions that Chavez made that were, in retrospect, wrong. He should have rebuilt the state rather than just creating these parallel societies that let everybody do whatever they wanted because the price of oil was high. He should have not anointed Nicolas Maduro his successor. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can understand it. just like there's a lot of ways you can understand what's going on in the United States. But you could also look at Mexico, where Claudia Sheinbaum has 85% approval, and she's the second president of a new political coalition that seems to be enormously popular and doing much to democratize society. You could look at Brazil, which jailed its coup plotters and has put good controls on social media to stop the spread of fascism. You could look at Uruguay. I mean, there's a lot of different countries you can look at other than Venezuela. And
Good controls on social media in terms of
well, social media is owned by private corporations, so it's not free speech. If an individual can, if Elon Musk can change the algorithms to, then that's hardly free speech. So yes.
Really have freedom of speech,
What's that?
and that's what Bolivar intended to transfer back to his native Venezuela through his
Yeah.
network.
Yeah.
So the state currently is sad.
Yeah. As it is
Especially
here.
when you consider Maduro,
Yeah.
who just invalidated an election. In other words, took the vote of the people away.
Yeah.
After
Yeah.
Machado clearly won.
Machado. Yeah. It wasn't Machado, but yeah. It was somebody else, but yeah.
Well, yeah, fellow, but she's the current spokesman.
Yeah.
He left
Yeah.
or had to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. It's bad. It's bad. Things are bad in Venezuela. Things are bad in the United States.
And just to wrap up, I will say that in my own work, like I've done a lot of work on Cuba. One of the things that you see in a lot of these more authoritarian regimes is you still see this kind of social democratic, you still see these grassroots movements from below, these social democratic movements from below that I don't know, that I still look to.
So Bukele in El Salvador, for instance, who's rigged the political system and is basically, will be president as long as he wants to be president, and is a close ally, and has created these concentration camps that the United States are using kind of as a new Guantanamo. El Salvador has the most draconian anti-abortion laws in the world, in which women who have miscarriages are sentenced to 10 to 20 to 30 years in jail. And there's social movements, and despite severe repression and the threat of incarceration, women are fighting back against those laws with enormous courage.
So, excuse me, you've had your opportunity to ask questions. Thank you so much for your input. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Greg Grandin. We appreciate your time.